Welcome to another Life on Film screening brought to you by the National March for Life. Today we are going to be showing the film Hush, a liberating conversation about abortion and women's health. My name is Josie Lutke. I am the CLC Youth Coordinator, and with me is Drew Martin of Mighty Motion Pictures and executive producer of Hush. Drew, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks, Josie. Thank you so much for having me.
So we'll get to the film momentarily, but first I want to ask Drew, can you give us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, Josie, I started in television working with CTV as a writer, producer, director in commercial production in Edmonton, which is where I was born and raised. And then I went to CBC Television. And then after that, I left there, started an independent production company called The Idea Factory. And I'll tell you a little story around that. And that was, West Edmonton Mall is the biggest, I think it may still be one of the biggest malls in the world. And I was working there as a construction worker. And part of my job was that I would have to go through at the end of the evening and I would be working around the site or walking around the site, kind of a security. And it was really cavernous and it was really awesome. And I would take the opportunity to praise the Lord and sing. And it was really awesome time. And one of the things I had to do was clean out the bathrooms. And so I was like, well, this is kind of humbling, God. And it is a little cliche, don't you think? But I was like, just really after the Lord. And I was thinking that day about how my friends have been talking about having ideas, but really not so much ideas as they were looking at video games. And they said, why don't we have Christian video games? Because we should have those. And I'm thinking, it just following after the world is really not what I want to do. Like, I want the very first. I want to be involved in that. I want to be like coming up with Pong, which, if you remember, is like the first video game, right? Which has had the little thing on the side of the screen and the ball that came across, right? And just then I was in the bathroom and I'm thinking about these things and I'm thinking about the Lord. I'm just, and all of a sudden, like the Spirit of the Lord came into the room in such a powerful way. I went to my knees and I could see Jesus' feet just right in front of me. And he said to me, well, then what you want to do is come to heaven for ideas, because heaven is an idea factory. And I was like, yes, Jesus, that's what I want to do. And I want to be led by your Spirit. And so that's why the first company that I had in production was called The Idea Factory. And so I had that company for 14 years. And then I started a company called Mighty Motion Pictures, which was based on Psalm 23, which is about, it says, open up you gates and be you lifted up you doors and let the King of Glory come in. Who is this King of Glory? He is the Lord God Almighty. And so that's that's the company that I currently am involved, that I own. But actually, God owns it. I just work for him.
That's a very great story. And can I ask now, what should our viewers expect watching this film? And is there anything in particular that they should be paying close attention to?
Well, I think they need to pay close attention the whole time, mostly because of the fact it's just so loaded with information that's amazing and information they've never heard before. In fact, many women watch the show and they so want their daughters to see the film, and because it's so life informing and relevant. And I used to, when I was going to festivals, I'd say to the people in the live audience, if you need to go to the bathroom, you should go now. Because if you go to the bathroom and miss like 3 minutes of this film, you will regret it, because it is that full of information that's going to be vital to your lives.
The way things are going in Indianapolis, before long, it is not just going to be you and your doctor at your doctor's appointment. It is going to be you and your doctor and the Indiana State Legislature. Your doctor will be forced by law to say out loud to you and to put in writing information that is not true about an imaginary link between having an abortion and getting breast cancer.
1.3 million abortions done in America every year, 2,000 partial birth abortions. What is that? 0.1%.
They remove the child and crush the skull. The child is born into
Usually,
this earth.
the woman's life is at risk, Elizabeth.
But there's an exception here. So if the woman's life is at risk, it won't even be, it's a mood issue.
What about the fact that one of the speakers at this conference promotes the factually incorrect statement that abortion leads to breast cancer? Do you believe that?
Well, I don't know what your scientific expertise is to be able to run that commentary. I confess that I don't have
It's not me, it's the
scientific
AMA.
expertise.
It's
Oh,
not
look,
me, it's the Australian Medical Association.
A woman comes to you, she says she's pregnant with a girl, and she wants to terminate the life of the child because it's a girl. What would you say to her?
My position has been very clear. The Liberal Party is the party of standing up for people's rights.
And an interesting position to hold. Yes, Liberal leader Justin Trudeau says he wouldn't try to talk a woman out of a sex-selective abortion, aborting a child based on gender alone.
He opened the door for debate. He's the one that introduced his party's policy on abortion, which is, no future MPs are allowed to be pro-life. So I asked him specifically about gendercide, and most people are saying, even though I'm pro-choice, wait a minute, I could never support a gendercide.
Yeah, I don't think people up until weeks ago have even had to really be forced into the conversation or the thinking. But now people are starting to think, okay, wait, what is my stance and how do I feel about it? A lot of people are realizing.
How do you feel when you watch these reports about abortion? I don't know about you, but I feel an incredible tension. I feel threatened, like I'm being drawn into a fight. I feel the need to side with one and to be suspicious of the other. My regularly inquisitive and objective nature goes out the window. Why does this happen to us? It's because in 1973, when the U.S. Supreme Court decision of Roe v. Wade legalized abortion, it also completely reshaped national politics and divided all of us into two camps, pro-choice and pro-life. Now, to question anything around abortion would be a betrayal of your camp. So, for example, when I watched this report, I instantly and unquestioningly sided with those defending women's rights and tuned out the others based on their self-righteous tone, conservative agenda, and religious jewelry. While it would have been easy for me to write her off completely, she is raising a question that few seem to be willing to ask. This is not a story about the legality of abortion. It's a story, like the others, about an issue associated with abortion. This news report is about a gendercide, a deliberate and systemic destruction of an estimated 160 million females due to sex selection abortions worldwide. And it's an issue that is especially prevalent in my own Indian culture, but because it's tied to abortion, no one's addressing it. If I, as a woman and a feminist, do not care about this horrific situation, then why would anyone else? I too was guilty of allowing my bias to overshadow my ability to listen and to identify a woman's issue when I heard it. Sure, I'm pro-choice, but before that, I'm a woman and a human being. So how can we get to the point of answers around abortion as an elective medical procedure when we can't even have a conversation?
Is it plausible that abortion might cause psychological problems or biological problems to the woman undergoing it? Just as your opinion.
Yeah. Yes, I think you could have psychological problems from having an abortion.
You can have psychological problems from absolutely anything. If this is a right for life, I'm sorry, I don't...
It's not. It's not. I'm pro-choice.
We're pro-choice. Are you pro-choice?
Barbara Kay is a columnist for the National Post. She offers a totally revolutionary approach to this volatile topic.
I really dislike this whole necessity to package yourself as pro-choice or pro-life. I am pro-information. When women find themselves in a situation where they have an unplanned pregnancy and they are uncertain, there isn't a great deal of information that is absolutely neutral ideologically. Obviously, the pregnancy centers want women not to have an abortion. I think the abortion clinics want women to have the abortion. Abortion is part of the greater field of women's reproductive health. And that, to me, should be a subject that we can all discuss without fear.
In the same spirit of open-mindedness, psychotherapists Dana Dovich and Candace Dupuis wrote a book called The Healing Choice, which encourages women to talk about their abortion experiences, no matter what their political leanings.
What we found as therapists was that women are coming into our office, they're talking about all kinds of really important experiences that they've had in their lives, but no one, I think probably we could say 99% of women had never brought up the fact that they had terminated a pregnancy. They would kind of tell us in code, or it would come out by mistake. So what we realized was, as therapists, this is not being talked about.
The biggest surprise we had was people could hardly hold the paradox and simply talk about a woman's experience, how they would have to move to the conflictual, right or wrong politics.
How lucky am I? I was born in Canada into a free democratic society. I have the right to property, the right to vote, the right to my opinion. I'm educated, I've traveled, and I'm healthy. Already, I have more than most women in the world, and I try never to forget that. I am a product of feminism. I was raised by a competent single mom who managed her professional career as an accountant as well as raising me. On my right wrist, I wear my mother's silver bracelet. On my left, I wear my grandmother's gold bracelets, so that each day I remember where I've come from, the battles that were fought by the women who came before me. I feel it's my duty to them to stand up and fight during my lifetime, so that the next generation of women might progress even further. Even though I had never had an abortion myself, I held views that were much like many other women. Abortion is a woman's legal right, hard-won by the women who came before me. Beyond that, I hadn't thought much about the topic. I presumed abortion was a difficult choice for a woman, but that it was a safe and healthy choice. So when I heard that there might be long-term health risks associated with abortion, and that new laws were enforcing the disclosure of these risks prior to an abortion, it sounded to me like an anti-abortion strategy, designed to both create fears in a woman prior to her procedure and to erode the legality of abortion. But when I heard the statistic that 40 to 50 million women worldwide have an abortion each year, 125,000 each day, the sheer number was alarming to me. In North America, 1 in 3 women will have an abortion in their lifetime. What if there really were some health risks? What were women actually being told before their abortions? How were these women doing afterwards? This is something we needed to be talking about, not dismissing entirely as myth and propaganda. We're not talking about pro-life and pro-choice anymore. We're talking about very serious claims, like breast cancer, premature birth, and psychological damage. And we should be able to discuss these openly. We're now talking about critical health risks related to abortion that may affect the lives of millions of women. These women have spoken out publicly about the pain from their abortions. They certainly don't represent all abortion experiences, but they deserve to be heard.
How it exploits us is we're not told the truth when we go into an abortion clinic. For my case, I went to a doctor's office to have a pregnancy test confirmed. I already thought I was. And he confirmed my pregnancy, patted me on the knee, said, "You don't look too happy. Don't worry, you can have an abortion." Well, I'd never even thought about abortion. It wasn't even a part of my world. But being young and naive, doctor told me about abortion. It must be okay. And I said, "What are the risks involved?" "Oh, there's no risks whatsoever. It's going to feel like you started your period. We're going to clean you out. There's absolutely no risk whatsoever." So not true. It caused cervical damage, uterus damage, not telling the overwhelming emotional damage that happened to me on that table.
The first abortion at 16, right after I had the procedure, I put my mask on and I went to a Mother's Day banquet. because I needed my mom and her congregation not to know about what I had just done. And I get sick. So I go running to the restroom and immediately start throwing up. And when I throw up, I hemorrhage.
And I was so enabled to have children because within a month or two, I had a hysterectomy because of the damage to my uterus.
You know, they need to inform us. What are the risks? When you're doing heart surgery, brain surgery, this is what's going to happen. This is how it's going to affect you. This is how your life is going to change. Are we hearing that? They're still trying to hold back information.
Dr. David Grimes is an obstetrician gynecologist who has studied, taught, and provided abortions for over 4 decades. He is an internationally renowned scholar on the subject of abortion.
What about long-term effects?
Because abortion is done primarily in young women, many of whom have their reproductive lives lying ahead of them, this question has been intensively and extensively studied over the years. What we now know is there are no long-term consequences from abortion, either reproductive or otherwise. And that includes psychological effects as well.
Evidently, there's a discrepancy here between what the medical community holds true and what some women have actually experienced, and this disparity is seen on the political level as well. The United States has many laws around informed consent for medical procedures, the specifics of which are governed at a state level. 35 states require that women receive counseling before an abortion is performed. 25 of those communicate a potential effect on future fertility. 22 states mandate that women be given counseling on the mental health effects of abortion. And in 5 states, it is mandated that you are told that there is a possible association between abortion and increased breast cancer risk. Of all the contested healthcare risks around abortion, the abortion breast cancer link was especially troubling to me. Where was this idea coming from?
The abortion breast cancer link is an old dog that they keep on flogging. It's time to stop. There's a small group of persons who hold the views. These people tend not to be physicians. They don't really understand what a woman goes through in this decision. And they also tend not to have any training in epidemiology, that is, research methods. The common theme, however, is religiosity.
One of those people is Dr. Joel Brind. The major criticism against him is that because he is pro-life, his science is questionable, and his findings are part of an anti-abortion agenda to scare women. In 1996, he conducted a meta-analysis, which is a review of multiple studies. In this case, the results from 23 studies found a 30% increased risk of breast cancer for women with abortion histories.
Are you trying to stop abortion?
I don't believe it's good for women or children, and I certainly understand that women have a choice about it, and I think it's important that they have an informed choice.
Pro-life scientists might be more motivated to get into this subject because they have suspicions to say, oh, this study is no good because look at the scientists behind them. Some of them are pro-life, and some of them, by the way, are pro-choice, but they never point to the pro-choice ones who are coming to the same conclusions as the pro-life ones.
I know Vern Chinchilla is pro-choice, but interestingly enough, I didn't even know that until there was a press conference. We did all this work together, hours and hours of working together and studying the data and comparing notes and talking about it. And you know what? Whether he or I or anyone else in the group was pro-life or pro-choice, it never came up. This is about science. This is about the effect on women and whether or not abortion increases the risk of breast cancer. Period.
Dr. Angela Lanfranchi is a breast cancer surgeon who speaks internationally about the biology of how abortion could lead to breast cancer. She's been criticized for making extreme statements that are contrary to the medical establishment.
Do you want abortion to go away?
This is about having fewer patients in my office that are 30 years old with breast cancer. Breast cancer is a leading cause of death of women between 20 and 59. This is about stopping the ever-increasing numbers of breast cancer. And I'm sorry if it offends, but these are the medical facts.
A new study in a major medical journal shows more women from the ages of 25 to 39 may be getting advanced breast cancer and researchers don't know why.
Doctors will tell you we already know that breast cancer in younger women is a double-edged sword. First of all, it does tend to be more aggressive, and compounding that is the fact that we're just not looking as hard for it.
There was 1 month where I saw 3 young women in their 30s with breast cancer, and it was very depressing. And I was trying to figure out why that was happening. The textbooks had information in it about one of the risk factors being abortion. And I started asking a complete reproductive history. And at that point, I had 2 young women that had very aggressive breast cancers. And that was their history. One had had 7 pregnancies and 5 abortions, and another one had 5 pregnancies and 3 abortions, and they were all young in their 30s, and they died very quickly. And then when Joel Brin's meta-analysis came out, I said, okay, it's just not my random clinical experience. And at that point, I thought that it would get out, that women would become aware of those facts. And over the years, I've realized that no, it didn't matter how many studies there were, that that information was not going to get out.
Breast cancer also runs in my family, and I wanted to know about the risk of abortion.
So that's actually kind of a myth. There's no evidence to support that abortion has any relation to the incidence of breast cancer. We haven't been able to find that demonstrated in any research that's ever been done.
Dr. Ian Gentles is a co-author of the book Complications that calls itself the world's most comprehensive investigation of abortion and women's health.
And the big physical hazard is breast cancer. There have been many dozens of studies, and a high proportion of those studies show a real statistically significant link between abortion and breast cancer. In other words, if you have an abortion, you have a 30 or 40% increased chance of coming down with breast cancer later. And this has been established in studies all over the world, not just in the United States, but also France, China, Japan, India, which have documented that indeed there is a higher rate of breast cancer among women who have abortions.
The jury is in. There is no relationship between either a miscarriage or induced abortion and breast cancer. And this is the opinion of all the major medical organizations around the world that have looked at this. And these include the American Cancer Society, the Canadian Cancer Society, the National Cancer Institute, the World Health Organization, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada.
I tried to interview each of these organizations. I wanted to get their position on the abortion breast cancer link, to ask them about these studies and their process of determining that there was no link. But from every one, I was denied an interview. They simply said that the case was closed, that they had no one available to speak about the subject, and anything I needed to know could be found on their website. This is where I started to feel equally suspicious of those denying any link. I felt like I was digging into something much deeper and darker. If the jury was in, why wouldn't they stand behind their findings and speak to me? So I followed their suggestions and visited their websites. Each one referred to a 2003 conference put on by the National Health Institute's Cancer Division, the NCI, where it was concluded once and for all that there was no link between abortion and breast cancer. Clearly, I needed to talk to the NCI, but not only did they deny me an interview, when I tried to visit the National Cancer Institute in person, I quickly got escorted off the grounds. What was going on here? It was like they really didn't want any questions being asked. I had to do some more digging for myself. What I found most concerning was that even with the millions of dollars being raised to find a cure, the education and popularization of breast cancer, and the advancements in science and medicine, breast cancer incidences are much higher today than they were a generation ago. And still, they can only attribute 20% of breast cancer cases to family history. They didn't seem to know what caused the other 80%. Patrick Carroll is a British statistician who has studied the correlation between abortion and breast cancer in 8 European countries.
For an individual woman, the best predictor of breast cancer is her family history. But if we're looking at trends, the genetic factors don't explain the trend. But the modern increased incidence is about 80 or 100% more than it was in the early part of the 20th century. The increased modern incidence is published, but it's not explained by focusing on such risk factors as legally induced abortion, can provide an explanation.
What sort of numbers did you find?
Very high correlation, more than 0.9 for breast cancer and abortion, much higher than anything else. I'd worked on 8 countries where there's a full count of abortions in the official published national statistics, but the trends are similar.
In fact, the correlations found in his studies were so strong that he was able to make accurate forecasts of future breast cancer rates based on their abortion rates. In the United States, between 1982 and 1987 alone, invasive cases of breast cancer rose an alarming 32% and has remained around those levels ever since. Some of this increase was attributed to modern early detection techniques. But early detection, of course, doesn't add to the number of cases. It just prevents death by detecting cases 1 to 3 years earlier than they would have been. Hence, the small spike and drop. So what caused the rest of the increase? One major factor that had changed in young women's lives exactly 10 years before this increase is the rise in the number of abortions following legalization. 10 years is the same amount of time it takes a cancerous cell to develop to the point of detection, and yet the medical establishment calls this factor purely coincidental. Dr. Frida Bush is an obstetrician gynecologist and an educator from Mississippi who speaks about how abortion is affecting the African American community.
I have seen breast cancer increase in the African American community, and especially among the younger women. When you find women who have breast cancer during the expected time, then you consider that could be aging. But when you have women in their 20s and 30s, then you have to look for another cause. African Americans are approximately 13% of the population of the United States, but we obtain 37 to 39% of the abortions. There has to be a link between the high rate of abortions in the African American community and the high rate of breast cancer in younger women in the African American community.
So if there's truth to the correlation between abortion and breast cancer, it certainly is concerning. But how could they possibly be related? How could abortion cause breast cancer? I needed to shift the investigation away from those promoting or denying a link and speak to someone neutral who could explain the science of breast cancer. I spoke with Dr. Pierre Band, a pioneer in the study of medical oncology, who taught me about the nature of the disease.
Perhaps the simplest thing to keep in mind is the painting experiments of rabbit ears. If you paint a rabbit ear with cancer-causing substances at a small dose, nothing happens. But if you add to that a substance that induces cell proliferation, then all of a sudden the cancer will occur. And this is what has been referred as the two-step or two-stage carcinogen model, with what is called initiation and promotion. And the problem with estrogens is that they're both initiators and promoters.
So if you think about any breast cancer risks, they all have to do with when do you get exposed to estrogen and how much do you get exposed to? It causes our breast cells to proliferate, which means they multiply through division. And every time a cell divides through division, it has to copy its DNA. And every time a cell copies its DNA, there are possible mistakes that are going to be made.
I think of the old I Love Lucy version where Ethel and Lucy had chocolates and they were making them and the assembly line was sped up. Something's going to go wrong. When that happens in the human body, it's called a DNA error. That increases your risk of breast cancer.
I certainly didn't know this basic biology, that estrogen is seemingly responsible for a majority of breast cancers in one way or another.
Had you ever heard that the hormone estrogen is a carcinogen, can be a cancer-causing agent?
I did not hear that. I didn't know that at all.
No, I hadn't heard about that. No.
That's why the more menstrual cycles a woman has in her lifetime, the higher her risk of breast cancer. But one of the things that protects us from breast cancer is childbirth.
If one looks at the breast structures, essentially what it is, it's a tube that ends bluntly or with a few little bags-like structures. As the breasts mature, then the breast structure develops. Just think of grapes with the tubes leading to open little bags, these bags secreting milk. But the full maturation occurs during the latter part of the first full-term pregnancy.
Once a cell or series of cells, a tissue structure like a breast lobule, becomes terminally differentiated, performing its mature function, its ability for cellular reproduction becomes turned off. So we know, for example, that there is what we call a susceptibility window between puberty and first-term pregnancy, when her breasts are adult size and there's a lot of breast tissue, but which has not been differentiated in order to become milk-producing tissue. It's more vulnerable to carcinogens because these cells are cells which are easily prompted to divide.
Jeanette Joyce has been a breast imaging specialist since 1975. She's an educator of mammography, breast disease, and breast health to health professionals, and also a survivor of breast cancer.
We know that the best scenario for healthy breasts is to have many children, to start very early, and to breastfeed. The purpose of the breast is to produce milk for the young. So once that purpose has been fulfilled and those breast cells have become mature, they're less vulnerable to developing breast cancer. And that's a fact that's agreed upon by all medical organizations. All doctors will agree with that.
Dr. Anthony Miller is said to be one of the fathers of epidemiological study. Epidemiology, the study of groups of people, is the cornerstone of public health and informs policy decisions and practices by identifying factors of risk and prevention for disease.
The fact that women are having children older is going to increase their risk of breast cancer. This is something they should understand. Women need to know when they're young, if they delay their first pregnancy beyond the age of 25, and particularly beyond the age of 30, they will more than double their risk of breast cancer. And this should be part of public education. There are certain aspects of life which influences one's risk of disease, perhaps particularly cancer. So I find no excuse that this shouldn't be common knowledge.
So why was this not being communicated? I shouldn't have been learning this information for the first time as an adult woman. Breast cancer organizations consistently promote breastfeeding as a preventative choice. But where is the information about early childbirth being protective? And where is the information about increased risk of late or no childbirth?
I was just curious if you had ever heard that having a child, full-term pregnancy, was actually a protective factor against breast cancer later in life.
No. I had no idea. We've never learned about that.
It's not something I've heard, and that's embarrassing because I'm a nurse. But I'm in my 60s, so that probably information didn't come out till when did they know that?
Since the 18th century, it's known that women who never get pregnant have a higher rate of breast cancer than women who do get pregnant. They found that nuns had a significantly higher rate of breast cancer than married women. And of course, nuns didn't get pregnant. Abortion is one way of, if not making you never pregnant, at least delaying pregnancy. And the longer you delay pregnancy, the higher rate of breast cancer.
This line of reasoning, which is really grotesque, suggests that if women really want to protect their breasts 50 years down the road, they should have a baby at 13. Clearly, it's going to lower their risk. Most 13-year-olds don't think that's useful expenditure of their time to have a baby in 13.
I don't think anyone was suggesting that children have children. But I have to admit, when I first heard the health benefits of having children and having them early, it sort of irritated me. The notion of having children younger was at odds with the modern values that I held to, of education and financial independence. But I saw a growing irony. We were omitting and withholding fundamental knowledge about women's health. If, as a society, we really believe in women having authority over our own bodies, choosing if and when we want to have kids, really planning our parenthood, should we not be entitled to all the information, regardless of whether we want kids or not? Regardless of whether or not that information is at odds with the cultural norm? It might make sense that breast cancer organizations would shy away from anything that challenged modern female values or presume to tell women what to do. Yet they don't hesitate to tell us to wear pink, to stop smoking, to breastfeed, or to lose weight. And some of those are certainly not easy choices to make, but they are far more culturally acceptable.
Is that not information, though, that should be available to women?
Women should know that early childbearing will confer protection against breast cancer. However, in the trend in the United States, at least, I don't know about Canada, but in the United States, we see later and later onset of first birth. For educational attainment and for professional reasons, women are delaying that first birth further. But women should know that if they do that, they increase the risk of perhaps breast cancer and also infertility. They may have a harder time getting pregnant when they decide to do so in their 30s. I absolutely believe women should know all the truth that we know.
So with this understanding of breast development and breast cancer and the protective factor of early childbirth, the question is still, how might abortion increase breast cancer risk?
I think that when you have hormones coursing through your body and you abruptly stop them, it probably causes a problem. I don't know exactly what, because I'm not a medical doctor, but I can't help but assume that abruptly stopping those hormones could cause issues, physical ones.
As soon as she gets pregnant, as soon as you have an embryo floating down the fallopian tube before implantation, that embryo is producing HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. And when the HCG goes way up, you start putting out a lot of estrogen and progesterone. And what that's doing is it's stimulating the mother's breast tissue to grow. But all she's doing is making more of the type 1 and 2 lobules, which are immature and cancer susceptible. And it's only after 32 weeks, when the human placental lactogen level goes high, that you start getting the full differentiation. That's when women start getting the protective effect of a full-term pregnancy. So by interrupting the pregnancy before that differentiation, you've left your breasts with more places for cancers to start. And that's why induced abortion increases the breast cancer risk. It's exactly the same pathophysiology that causes premature birth before 32 weeks to double breast cancer risk. And nobody disputes that premature delivery before 32 weeks doubles breast cancer risk.
Was this true? None of the health organizations make this public assertion, but the 3 large studies that investigated preterm birth prior to 32 weeks all showed an increased breast cancer risk and show clearly the decrease in risk that is achieved between 32 and 40 weeks of pregnancy. Something that had been a painful reality in my own reproductive life is that I lost my first child. I remember really wanting to wait to have a family after I got married at 30. 2 years into my marriage, I was ready. But in my last trimester, just before 32 weeks, I was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. It was a very severe and rare form of preeclampsia or hypertension, and made even more unusual because there were no previous warnings. We had a son. He was perfect, and we named him after our favorite city in India, Jaisalmer. And I was a mother to him as long as I was meant to be. I was given a 50-50 chance of survival and fought for my own life over the next 2 days. If what Dr. Lanfranchi said was true about abortion and premature birth, that meant that my health and my life could be at risk once again.
What about miscarriage?
Most miscarriages, 90% of them, occur in the first trimester. And a lot of women will go to their doctor and say, I didn't even know I was pregnant. Well, they didn't know they were pregnant because they didn't have any of those signs of pregnancy, like they didn't get nauseous or their breasts didn't get sore and tender, one of the first signs of pregnancy.
There's typically not enough estrogen being produced to sustain that pregnancy. So that pregnancy ends. That means you don't have that gigantic burst of estrogen exposure and changes to the breast tissue.
That is different than spontaneous abortions in the second trimester. Those usually occur from a physical problem. In those pregnancies, the hormonal levels were normal, and so she's has more breast tissue and she's made more of the immature lobules where breast cancers start.
I just couldn't believe it. Not only did I have to suffer this awful, gut-wrenching experience of losing my son, but also my risk for breast cancer might be doubled. This was a bizarre twist of fate in the making of this film. I set out to investigate the health risks for women who've had abortions, and now I was faced with my own breast cancer risk. But who was I supposed to trust? A handful of pro-life scientists, or the health organizations being dismissive and patronizing? Someone tell me the bloody truth. This was now my body and my life at stake. I couldn't just put my hands over my ears and carry on with my life. I had to keep digging. Just like abortion, health organizations deny that miscarriage has any increased risk. But only one study that I could find separated late-term miscarriages from early miscarriages. This study from Iran found that one miscarriage after 12 weeks increased women's risk of breast cancer by 6 times. After gathering the facts to this point, there were certainly some legitimate explanations of how abortion and breast cancer could be related. What happened at the 2003 NCI conference that they were able to come out with such a broad, sweeping statement as to say there's absolutely no risk and no connection with either abortion or miscarriage? A recording of the conference was still available online, and I went through it frame by frame.
Now, while it is neither the topic nor the purpose of this workshop, I would like to briefly address an issue that has been on some people's minds.
The National Cancer Institute at the time had on their website a page on abortion breast cancer, which was equivocal. Well, there are some studies that show there's a risk. There are some studies that don't. We don't really know. We are investigating and so forth. Right as director Andrew von Eschenbach took over at the helm of the National Cancer Institute, a new version of the website was put on his desk for him to sign on to, which went from being very equivocal to very close to being certain that there is no link. 28 congressmen actually signed on to a letter asking Dr. von Eschenbach to take down the website and review it because it was contradictory to what they understood as the scientific facts at the time.
This meeting would then serve as a foundation for further information and illuminate the future course of our research. That is how you came to be invited to this workshop.
I didn't even get through the introduction before finding something odd and contradictory. The NCI director just said that the abortion breast cancer question was not the topic or the purpose of the workshop, but it was the reason they were there. So which was it? In spite of the assertion that 100 experts decided the case was closed on the abortion breast cancer link, only a small handful of them were scientists who had actually done research directly related to the subject, and only one presented, Dr. Leslie Bernstein.
I have 20 minutes. So if I start speaking very fast, you'll understand because I'm not sure I can cover it all in 20 minutes. I'm going to do my best. Conclusions, the data, I didn't present all of the data, but the data published since the 1996 and 97 meta-analyses and our new data also show no adverse impact of induced abortion or miscarriage on breast cancer risk. Thank you very much.
Dr. Pat Fagan co-authored a 2014 comprehensive review paper on the subject of the abortion and breast cancer connection.
If we take the National Cancer Institute workshop, given the diversity of findings,
that were out there, there's no way you can sort of say there is no link. That's not good science. That's politics.
It is a very scientifically complex subject. Arguments around the data focus on the fact that many of the largest studies don't show a link, and some studies even show a decreased risk of breast cancer. Further complicating the matter is the idea that some women may not be telling the truth about their abortion history, in which case studies that show an increased risk may be exaggerated, while studies that show no risk may be understated. To understand this situation better, we can look at the connection between smoking and breast cancer. This is a health risk that is now conclusive, but there was once a lot of conflicting data, much like the abortion breast cancer link. But they didn't close the case on the science. They dug deeper to understand what was influencing the contradictory findings. In fact, it was Dr. Pierre Band who found a physiological explanation.
It was important in our study with cigarette smoking to identify at what age the woman began to smoke, and it was clearly noted that the risk was confined to the time when women initiated cigarette smoking within 5 years of their first period.
So if a young woman smokes cigarettes before she has a full-term pregnancy, her risk of breast cancer goes up 600%. But if she smokes after a full-term pregnancy, her risk only goes up 69%. So you see the protective effect of that full-term pregnancy.
And I think that there is a parallel also with the age at which an abortion occurred.
This can be seen in many studies. For example, the 2007 Harvard Nurses study is said to show no overall link between breast cancer and abortion. But when you look at specific groups inside the study, women who had an abortion and had children showed no increased risk. But a 26% risk increase was found in the group of women who had had an abortion but had no children.
The data that doesn't fit is precisely the data where we learn most. If it repeatedly comes up, anomalous data, data we wish wasn't there, wishing abortion didn't have anything to do with breast cancer. But if you keep getting occasional data that points to it, that's the data that's going to force the growth of knowledge the most.
So if the studies on the subject line up with textbook biology of breast development, why was this important information overlooked at the NCI's Early Reproductive Events and Breast Cancer Conference?
Mads Melby and his colleagues in Denmark published a paper that was the linkage of 3 registries that showed no effect overall of induced abortion on breast cancer risk.
The 1997 Melby study that's reported in the popular literature as showing no increased risk of breast cancer actually showed a statistically significant increased risk with abortions occurring in the second trimester. And so there was an increased risk of about 3% per week's gestation.
When did abortion occur? First month, second month, third, fourth? Might be a big difference because the breast differentiation evolves with the duration of pregnancy.
You have more immature breast tissue than when you started. So the later in pregnancy, up to 32 weeks, before you have the abortion, you will have a higher risk. That's what's found in studies.
The Yi study, a cohort of 267,000 Shanghai women, again is often claimed to provide proof against the abortion breast cancer link, when it distinctly shows a greater risk increase depending on how long the pregnancy lasts before the abortion.
The first study I want to highlight is that of my colleague Janet Dowling, because it actually created a huge amount of interest and concern about the effects of induced abortion.
The Dowling study is quite important. It got featured in Time magazine and was funded by the National Cancer Institute, which of course gave it major standing.
In this study, no matter how you looked at the data, there was an increase in risk associated with induced abortion of about 50%.
Even more important, though, is the specifics of this study. It showed that women who have abortions at 18 or under have a 150% increased risk of breast cancer. And even more telling, those women under 18 who had had abortions past 9 weeks of pregnancy showed an 800% increased risk of breast cancer.
What happened in the Jan Daling study? Well, it was politically pretty incorrect.
At one point, she actually said she was tired of having rocks thrown at her because she had the audacity to publish her findings and to stick by her findings that abortion was associated with an increased risk of breast cancer. It didn't change her feelings about abortion as an option, just about what its consequences might be and what women have a right to know about the effects of choosing that option. That's all.
Dr. Janet Daling did present at the NCI conference, but presented only on a topic unrelated to abortion and breast cancer. Whether this was by her choice or by request of the organizers is unsure.
And today she'll speak on breast cancer tissue markers. Janet.
This is not surprising. I mean, the NCI is the major funding instrument for breast cancer research, or any cancer research for that matter. And so anyone in a position where they're dependent upon NCI funding is going to be reluctant to say anything which would jeopardize it, and that's perfectly understandable.
It's not that surprising that science is affected by politics as well. In 2005, a study in the British journal Nature found that by mid-career, 1 in 5 National Health Institute researchers admitted to changing the design, methodology, or results of studies based on pressure from a funding source.
So you see how the situation, the whole funding mechanism and research and reporting of research has really gotten quite corrupt. That isn't to say that a lot of good research isn't done, that isn't corrupt and that's honest and that's competent. But when it enters into an area that's politically loaded, like abortion, all bets are off.
Okay, let's open it up to the participants.
Yes, Joel Brind, Baruch College, New York City. I found it rather astonishing that with regard to the issue of abortion and breast cancer, that there is no association in consideration of the long history of studies, many very good studies, even done by some of the people in this room, which have shown significant positive association.
I will simply respond by saying that with respect to these questions, there was widespread view that the statement that was written here and presented before you reflected accurately the literature as we understand it today.
So they came to a final conclusion based on a 20-minute presentation. Then they opened the floor to questions and quickly dismissed the one challenge to the findings. It seems unbelievable. This conference, that according to the director of the NCI was supposed to, in his words, serve as a foundation for further research. Instead, not only did it close the door to any further research and discussion, but apparently it also eliminated the need to answer questions from documentary makers and women concerned about their breast cancer risk after an abortion or late-term miscarriage.
Nothing is black and white, particularly in epidemiological research. Well, here the NCI wanted science to say something, to come out with this finding. Over time, that 2003 NCI conference is going to become an embarrassment in the history of the NCI itself.
When everybody knew that tobacco caused cancer, one of the last people to admit it was the National Institute of Health, because senators in the southern states had a lot of influence in funding that organization, and they were from tobacco-growing states. Can you imagine that the National Institute of Health would be years behind the Surgeon General? It doesn't seem probable, but it happens all the time.
Back in the old days, men were the masters, women were the slaves. Women had the duties, men had all the rights. Then at last, women won their rights, and one by one, they won them all.
You've come a long way, baby, to get where you got to today. You've got your own cigarette now, baby. You've come a long, long way.
It wasn't just the manufacturers that delayed the spread of health information. At the time, saying there was something wrong with cigarette smoking was an unpopular idea, but telling people what they had a right to know didn't take away people's choice. Instead, We mandated that cigarette companies make accurate health information known to the users so they could make an informed choice.
This same trend happened about 15 to 20 years ago, where women were constantly told it's okay to take hormones after menopause. They were told it doesn't cause breast cancer, and then all of a sudden, the Women's Health Initiative came along and said, wait a minute, it does cause breast cancer.
Hormone replacement therapy, estrogen plus progestin, once the most commonly prescribed medication for women 50 and older, not only increases the risk of aggressive breast cancer, but also increases the risk the cancers will be more advanced and deadly.
This is all part of that original study in 2002. It was called the Women's Health Initiative.
Right.
And it came to an abrupt end because of a very dramatic finding.
It came to an abrupt end in 2002. The women who were on a combination had higher levels of breast cancer. And interestingly, we watched breast cancer rates drop after that study was completed.
The same drugs, estrogen and progestins, are in oral contraceptives. So women should know that. You know, I have patients in my office that come in at 22 with very proliferative breast disease, and they were put on the pill when they were 12 years old because they had menstrual cramps. There are other things that we can give for menstrual cramps besides a group 1 carcinogen.
When the World Health Organization categorized the pill as a group 1 carcinogen, the media blackout was overwhelming. People do know about it, but I will tell you that in my experience, 99% of physicians have no idea that the World Health Organization classified the pill as a group 1 carcinogen. They have no idea that there's even a link between abortion and breast cancer. You're not hearing about these things because the medical organizations, the medical media, and the main media are, in my view, actively screening them out. I think it's a crime.
There ought to be, from here on, an intimate relationship between the knowledge of the development of the breast during its full stages of maturation and the investigation of the abortion-breast cancer link.
But I think, given that the issue is settled, to continue doing studies of an answered question is not appropriate. Not only is it not appropriate, it's also unethical.
The Earth is round. That subject is closed. But true scientists will never say that anything to do with science is closed. The door is always open to new discoveries, to new research. Once you say a subject is closed, what you're really saying is, I don't want any more research done on this topic.
Between 2008 and 2014, just in South Asia, there have been a dozen studies. When you average them all together, the overall average odds ratio or risk increase is in excess of 400%. In places like India, where the traditional woman has gotten married and started having children in her teens, doesn't smoke, doesn't drink, breastfeeds all her children, there really are very few risk factors for breast cancer, and abortion and contraceptive birth control pills are about it.
Stephen Mosher was one of the first American social scientists allowed to do research in China. He was there when they implemented their mandatory one-child policy, which enforced abortion and sterilization as a method of population control.
But in China, of course, we've now had 3.5 decades of this experiment that has been carried out by the Chinese government, in effect, on hundreds of millions of Chinese women. And rates of breast cancer in China are skyrocketing.
This was very amply demonstrated in a meta-analysis of 36 studies from China that was just published, actually. That showed that there was a 44% increase with 1 or more abortions, going up to a 76% risk with 2 or more abortions, and up to about a 90% risk with 3 or more.
This breast cancer epidemic is a looming disaster for Chinese women who've already suffered, in my view, more than enough under the terms of the one-child policy.
It's kind of disconcerting, especially when you consider that if you look at just India and China alone, you have over 1 billion women. If half of them have an abortion at one time or another, and let's say their lifetime risk of breast cancer goes up by a total of 2%, you're still talking about millions of women.
If we find even something increasing risk of a common disease such as breast cancer by 20 to 30%, we would regard that as important and would require something to be done about it. So weak association for breast cancer may still be very important in terms of trying to prevent the disease in as many people as possible.
When I lost my first son because of preeclampsia and HELLP syndrome, apparently there was a 1 in 1,000 chance of occurrence. That might seem like the odds were pretty low, but that doesn't help much when you're the one. Since then, I've never looked at stats the same way. They're not just numbers, they're people, lives. I look at stats and feel the anguish of that one. You can postulate and posture all you want, but when it's your life at stake, it's amazing how the information suddenly means something. So what could all these reproductive factors mean about our breast cancer risk? Well, if you're a North American woman, your lifetime risk of breast cancer is 1 in 8. Let's say at 20 years old, you get pregnant for the first time. If you have the child, you decrease your risk by 1/3 to about 1 in 12. If you have the average abortion at about 8 weeks, there seems to be an increased risk of 20 to 40%, which means your lifetime risk could be 1 in 6. Then you delay having a child until 30 years old, your lifetime risk is possibly up to 1 in 5, and even higher for someone like me with a late-term miscarriage, a late-term abortion, or a preterm birth before 32 weeks.
It's also different from other risk factors in terms of the singularity of the choice. That is to say, yes, smoking cigarettes increases the risk of lung cancer tremendously. If you smoke 10 or 20 cigarettes for 10 or 20 years, if you smoke 1 cigarette, it doesn't make a difference. But one choice to have an abortion makes a significant impact. So it's certainly, by any reasonable standard of medical ethics and the requirement of a physician or other medical practitioner to seek informed consent before proceeding with any sort of intervention, would require that women be informed of it, and by and large, they are not.
I was diagnosed at the age of 42. I can tell you I'm the one that was standing at the processor when my films dropped out. I began looking at what could have caused this. I knew it wasn't alcohol consumption. I knew it wasn't obesity. When you are diagnosed with breast cancer, no one's willing to even acknowledge these as risk factors. And I've read things about this and why. They actually say the reason is that woman is going through a lot of suffering with this diagnosis. And we don't want them beating themselves up, thinking that they caused their own breast cancer because they had an abortion.
In my family, there's quite a bit of breast cancer that is associated with the BRCA2. It's a genetic thing. So we've seen tremendous publicity around that. And when Angelina Jolie had her double mastectomy, she was not considered feminist or anti-feminist. It had nothing to do about women's rights. It was a health issue. If abortion is shown to give you, say, a 30% risk or something like that, isn't that news? You're not seeing it at all in the news because it's about abortion.
Eve Silver is a former research analyst with the Susan G. Komen Foundation and a breast cancer survivor.
I had bilateral mastectomies, and that is an awful situation. If I had known about the link between abortion and breast cancer, and further, if I had known that all of my reproductive history was still in my future, I believe I would have gotten the help that I needed to carry my child to term.
If I had known that early pregnancy would lower my risk of breast cancer, and my mother and grandmother died of it, I wouldn't have waited until 17 years into my marriage to have my first and only child. I would have had one a lot earlier. It's just that I wasn't aware of it. So I think that women can make informed choices about what's best for them. And then if they are at increased risk, say they can't stay away from cigarettes, or they've had an induced abortion at a young age, or you've had an induced abortion in the second trimester when you've had a lot of breast tissue, at least get screened at an appropriate age with an appropriate test. It's not the fickle finger of fate that's giving women breast cancer. We know a lot about breast cancer. We know a lot about what increases risk and what it decreases risk. So I would hope that women would become educated about all of them.
Although more study is needed to determine the extent of the abortion-breast cancer link, to entirely deny the connection is ludicrous, especially when you consider that a woman's reproductive history and her breast cancer risk are directly related, and abortion is as much a part of reproductive history as childbirth. In all honesty, because of my own bias, I still apply some discretion to the information coming from pro-life individuals, but I do find validity to their claims. What I found most sickening, though, is that the media and health organizations have spent their energies closing the case and vilifying those who advocate in favor of the link, instead of investigating any and all reasons why breast cancer rates among young women have increased and women are dying. If women have the right to abortion, they should also have the right to know. Apart from breast cancer, the women I heard from and read about in my research experienced a number of other physical complications as a result of their abortion that are not being acknowledged by abortion clinics or the media. Things like difficulty getting pregnant, future miscarriages, premature birth, and even sterility.
I finally did have a child when I was 26 years old. He had to be delivered early, and there was a lot of complications during the birth. We both almost died.
In first trimester abortion, they take a very small instrument and use gentle suction to help pull the pregnancy out.
Okay.
So there's actually no altering to your body as it is. We have a couple of instruments that just make the hole in your cervix a little bit bigger, but not very much bigger. And it's sort of built to open much, much wider, like when you have a vaginal birth.
One of the things that we now know is that you put yourself at greater risk for a premature birth in a following pregnancy where you actually want to have the baby born.
Surgical abortion, and that's how most abortions are done, results in the introduction of instruments to enlarge the cervix, because during a normal pregnancy, of course, the cervix is locked shut very tight to keep the fetus inside. Well, that has to be opened, and it has to be opened by force. And this has a tendency to weaken the cervix, to tear it or simply to weaken it. The cervix is a muscle. So that will mean that in subsequent pregnancies, a certain percentage of women will experience what's called cervical incompetence. In other words, their cervix is not strong enough to hold the fetus in. It's not strong enough to hold back that placenta if it descends onto the cervix. And so you have the phenomenon of placenta previa and often premature births or an unsuccessful birth.
I didn't know that I was going to be having 11 pregnancies all told and only one full-term birth. I lost all of my other babies I wanted very badly, and my incompetent cervix couldn't carry my babies. My amniotic sacs would leak through, and it would hourglass and then pop, and my babies would be born preterm.
Every year in America, over 11,000 babies die on the day that they're born. Most are just born too early, their vital organs, heart and lungs still unformed. Even those who survive beyond 24 hours often die before their first birthday.
This is a big problem in the developing world. Why should Americans care about this?
Because it's a huge problem in America. In fact, 500,000 American babies are born too soon every year. America ranks number 6 in the whole world for numbers of preterm births.
Every year, 500,000 babies are born preterm?
That's correct.
The U.S. is a global leader in science and medicine, but they have one of the highest preterm birth rates in the world. How could this be? Just like breast cancer, we're seeing more and more awareness for premature birth. Clearly, the governments and health authorities are trying to reduce numbers of preemies. They even named November as Prematurity Awareness Month. But again, in all the materials, in all the reports, there is no mention of abortion as a possible risk factor.
In 1970, prior to the legalization of abortion in America,
The preterm birth rate was 6.6%. In 2006, the numbers were 12.6%, which means they have essentially doubled.
The most important study ever done on the subject is a systematic review meta-analysis by Prakash Shah from Toronto in 2009. The results of 37 studies found a 36% increased risk of preterm birth for one abortion and a 93% increased risk for 2 or more abortions, which is especially important to consider when about 1/2 of women having abortions in North America have already had a prior abortion. One of the most recent large record-based studies was done in 2013 by Ghislain Hardy of Montreal. They confirmed that it's the extreme preterm births prior to 32 weeks that are especially affected, showing around double the risk.
Having a baby that is born prematurely has a significant toll on the parents. Many of the babies end up coming home or being discharged at the time that they would have been born, but meaning they've been in the hospital sometimes 2 or 3 months. That is a significant psychologically, emotional, and financial burden.
Dr. Martin McCaffrey is a specialist in neonatal medicine in North Carolina. He's a strong advocate for awareness of the connection between abortion and premature birth because he has frontline experience with caring for premature babies and their families.
Any of us who do neonatology, what we hope to do ultimately at the end of the day is not have to come to work. And we'd all love to solve the problem of preterm birth. And it just was a huge question for me why this association wasn't talked about amongst myself, my peers, my colleagues. What we've seen over the last 10 years or so is lots of efforts to try and reduce preterm birth. What we have not impacted is the flat rate of very preterm birth, the birth of those babies less than 32 weeks gestation that sits flat now for the last 20 to 30 years at 1.8 to 2% of all births on an annual basis. For women who we think are at high risk for a future preterm birth, i.e. those women who've had a previous preterm birth, we have a medical therapy that we can employ. And that certainly does seem to reduce the risk for very preterm birth and preterm birth, potentially by as much as 30 to 40%. However, at risk, it does not at this time include the group of women who've had a prior abortion. Back in 1985, when the Surgeon General decided that he would put warnings related to preterm birth on cigarette packages for women who were pregnant, he had far less minuscule amounts of data compared to what we now have for the Association of Abortion and Preterm Birth.
Modern methods, such as the abortion pill and cervix softening agents, may help decrease the effect on premature birth, but surgical abortions are still the most common method. And instead of publicizing this risk, we're talking about risk factors that women have no control over.
If we look at what the statistics show us for who's at risk, it would be women who are carrying a multiple gestation, as you point out, so twins, triplets are higher. We also see, very sadly, racial inequities. So African American women are at almost double the risk of preterm birth as Caucasian women. And then third would be women who've had a previous history of a preterm birth.
While researchers struggle to understand why ethnicity appears to be associated with preterm birth, they are unwilling to even consider abortion as a factor that is putting African American women at higher risk.
In Mississippi, African Americans represent 39% of the population, but we obtain 78% of the abortions. In Mississippi also, we have the highest prematurity rate and the highest infant mortality rate, which is associated with prematurity. That is not coincidence.
It seemed there's a real clear unwillingness to deal with the science on this. In 2008, I was invited to be an expert panel member at the Surgeon General's Conference for Prematurity Prevention in Bethesda, Maryland.
What I would like to do right now is to charge each of you in this room, all the participants in this conference, with leaving no stone unturned.
The rare opportunity that each of you have to bring forward a recommendation that can go into the report. Each of you in the room have a vital contribution to make. in solving this terribly urgent problem of preterm birth.
At that point, I asked if we could bring up in the conversation the Association of Preterm Birth and Abortion. The co-chair looked back at me and he said, "There really isn't any such thing, Marty." I said, "There absolutely is, and here's 122 articles which say so." The co-chair said to the then and previous editor for the Institute of Medicine report, which was the basis for that Surgeon General's meeting and conference, "Did we discuss in the IOM report anywhere abortion and preterm birth?" And the editor looked up and said, "No, I don't believe we did." I said at that point, "Well, here it is in one of the appendices, that abortion is an immutable risk factor associated with preterm birth, and I believe we should discuss this." That said, the co-chairs refused to allow the discussion after a vote was taken, and it was decided that a majority did not wish to proceed with that discussion.
We must focus on research to define causes and mechanisms of parturition and prematurity at all gestational ages.
Talk about déjà vu. Another supposed health conference that voluntarily dismissed and omitted hard scientific evidence because of politics. When you consider the immense cost of prematurity, this kind of scientific misconduct is truly inconceivable. While 1 million preemies worldwide die each year, and those preemies who live face a huge risk of cerebral palsy, autism, mental retardation, lung disease, intestinal problems, vision and hearing impairment. Not to mention the cost of prematurity on families and our society.
You're literally talking about several $1,000s per day. So if you have a baby who's been in the hospital for 8 months, the math is pretty easy. You're closing in on $1 million of care just to get that baby home. If you could prevent one of those preemies, you save the system hundreds of thousands of dollars.
What we find, seeing that abortion at this point can account for 18% of very preterm births, is that the medical costs incurred in 1 year solely for the hospital costs of babies who die from abortion-related preterm births and babies who survive is $2.3 billion.
We don't ever hear about it, and we need to. Women with several abortions will have a much greater risk of preterm birth risks. We never hear about that.
So when I'm working in the neonatal intensive care unit and I'm there at 3 in the morning with a young mom, and she looks up at me through tears and said, "Why do I have this 25-week baby laying in this bed here?" And I look at her chart and I see she had no other obvious risks, but she's had potentially 1 or 2 prior abortions. What do I say to that woman? She still may have made that choice, but it should be an honest choice that she makes, weighing all the potential risks.
Is it possible that the cervix could be damaged in terms of like future chances to get pregnant, preterm birth or anything? Okay.
No.
Okay.
It's a really good question.
It had become obvious that questioning was necessary to find the truth about the physical risks related to abortion. And the same would be true with the psychological effects on women.
For me, it would be hard because I'd wonder what that person would have been like, had they made it into the world. So it's definitely something that I would struggle with.
Abortion is an incredibly invasive procedure, far more so than an annual Pap test. An abortion extends beyond the personal boundaries of a woman's vagina. It intrudes directly into the most private and sacred territory of a woman's body, into her womb, and into her psyche as well. Abortion clinics will tell you that a wide variety of feelings are normal and that serious long-term emotional problems after abortion are the same as after childbirth. On the other hand, pregnancy counseling centers quote studies that show that women who have an abortion have 6 to 7 times more suicides, as well as a myriad of other effects. Again, with extremes in the health information, who is a woman supposed to trust? Could abortion be having negative psychological effects? Is there more that we can learn to better support women pre- and post-abortion?
It was my ex-husband and myself who aborted my second child. And, for him, he was able to just say, let's just forget about it. I don't want to make sure nobody knows about this at my workplace. I don't want anyone to know. So it created so many anger issues within me because he could forget about it. My current husband, I was having anger issues towards him, and I had no idea why I was mad at him. I was just angry with men because it was an easy out for them, and I had to deal with it.
Within 3 years after my abortion, I was good as dead. With the drugs I began to use, with my sexual promiscuity, I was done. I was through.
Immediately after that abortion, I started self-destructing. And so after about 10 years of that, I'm feeling like I'm losing my mind. And I ended up going to a psychiatrist. Because I was scared to get out of bed in the morning. Basically, his answer for me was, you just gotta let go of this guilt.
I became depressed, anorexic. I had a deep depression. I tried to commit suicide twice. So I just wanted to destroy myself.
Is it possible that abortion leads to mental health issues?
The American Psychological Association has twice, during the Coop Report and then more recently, reviewed the entire world's literature on abortion and mental health. And their conclusion is that there is no evidence that having an abortion impacts a woman's mental health.
The 2008 report that Dr. Grimes refers to was led by Dr. Brenda Major. I asked her to expand on this conclusion of the American Psychological Association.
So the primary conclusion of our task force was that among adult women who have a legal first trimester abortion of a single pregnancy, one abortion, the risks of mental health problems are no greater than carrying that unwanted pregnancy to term, that there's no evidence of elevated risk among that group of women compared to women who pursue other options.
David Reardon has been called the Moses of the anti-abortion movement. However, since 1983, he's had several peer-reviewed studies published on the psychological effects of abortion.
They're making these very nuanced statements to make it sound like abortion's safe, though if you read the body of the paper, they make admissions. They identify 14 risk factors that identify women who are more likely to have problems after abortion, like being pressured into abortion. So a woman who feels pressured is more likely to have psychological problems. More than one abortion causes problems. So that's why they narrowed it to a single abortion. Of an adult woman, they're admitting basically for minors, there's more problems.
We've also found other factors that predict more problems post-abortion. For example, social stigma. The women who felt that other people would look down on them and they had to keep it a secret were faring more poorly than those who felt less stigmatized.
Spiritual beliefs about abortion being morally wrong is at higher risk. There's all these risk factors that predict women who have problems. So in essence, they're admitting that there's large groups of women who are at high risk of psychological problems after abortion.
Women have very different experiences. There is no one size fits all. I mean, not all women are going to be just fine, feel relieved, and not have any regret. And not all women are going to be traumatized and feel this is a terrible decision that they made either. I think that there's a lot of variability, but often that variability gets lost for those who want to say it's all this or all that.
There are countless feelings that women have about terminating a pregnancy. There's anger, loss, depression, there's sadness, guilt,
confusion,
relief. What we found was that over the course of a woman's reproductive life, we talked to women from ages 18 to 75. And when a woman was maybe she was 20, she got pregnant in college, she terminated the pregnancy, she felt so relieved. And then maybe when she's 35, she gets pregnant again. Her first pregnancy that she's going to keep, and mysteriously feelings about her abortion come up again.
Abortion is a stress reliever and a stress causer. Having the abortion means that there's going to be immediate sense of relief that my boyfriend's going to be happy with me because I did what he wanted, or I don't have to worry about, having to leave my job. Whatever stress that led to the decision to have abortion, that immediate problem is resolved. But there's new stresses that are taking place. The longer you follow women after abortion, the more women are going to start reporting that they had negative problems after abortion.
I sometimes talk about it as the head and the heart. My data suggests that over time, women don't change. Their minds don't change about that I made the right decision for myself. but they feel some regret. 79% of the women said they were highly satisfied with their choice. At 2 years, it was 72%. So there was a slight decline in reports of satisfaction and a slight increase in reports of regret.
When I first heard the stat of 79% of women reporting at 1 month that their abortion felt it benefited more than harmed, I almost glossed over it. But when I boiled down the numbers, that meant that 21% felt like it harmed more than helped. If there are 1 million women in the US having an abortion this year, that's 210,000 women who feel their abortions harmed them more than helped, which grows to 280,000 within 2 years. Where is the support for these women? Dr. Priscilla Coleman is a professor of human development and family studies. Her research has focused mainly on the psychological outcomes among women who have experienced abortion.
Often well-trained professionals will say that there is absolutely no risk of psychological problems associated with abortion. It's benign. It's just like getting your tooth pulled. It is different, and it's different because approximately 50% of women who actually go through with an abortion believe that they're terminating a human life. And there might be debate about whether an abortion is the end of a human life. What's important here is that 50% of the women who undergo it believe that. So if you believe that, that's likely to impact your mental health afterwards, because you have to assimilate with ending the life of a human being with who you are as a person.
Blanket claims that there's no psychological effects of abortion are just deliberately misinformed. They're holding an ideological position that's not supported at all by the research, and certainly not supported by anyone who ever bothers to interview and talk to women. It's really calling every woman who says, "I felt grief after my abortion," a liar.
Denise Mountainay is the founder of Canada Silent No More. She became a vocal pro-life lobbyist because of the psychological damage, pregnancy complications, and breast cancer she experienced after her abortions. What did you think abortion was?
It was just an operation, and I would be unpregnant. I was 16 the first time I found out I was pregnant. When I told my mother that I was pregnant, she said, "Oh, Denise, honey, you're only 16. She said, "You have your whole life ahead of you." She said, "Why don't you just come with me and you can have this operation and just forget about it and get on with your life." So I thought, oh, it's okay with my mom, it's okay with the government, it's okay with the doctors. So I thought it must be okay. The nurse said, "Oh, do you know why you're here?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Okay, come with me, put on this gown." We went down a long, long corridor, and I think I know why there was such a long corridor between the reception area and where the actual abortions took place, because you sure wouldn't want to hear the screams of the girls having abortions. And sorry, but sometimes I get flashbacks and I kind of relive. And when it was over, I curled up into a fetal position and I thought, that's it. I can't speak. I can't talk anymore. And I went into some kind of shock. I ended up getting an infection, damaged cervix, badly scarred uterus, and I had a lot of complications. I suffered many years just hating myself and feeling horrible. It was just very traumatic, and then I thought women need to know the truth about what an abortion really is and what it's doing to women.
Women who have had abortions tend to be the loudest voices in terms of trying to educate the public about the potential harms. They typically have to turn to religious types of interventions because there isn't any mainstream help.
There's a tradition in culture, even around post-traumatic stress disorder, to blame the victim. In World War I, there was a tendency to blame the guy suffering from shell shock with just being a malingerer or a coward, or somehow it's their fault that they're not able to be manly enough to get back out there and fight just because they saw some deaths and some bombs exploding around themselves. With abortion trauma, a lot of people want to claim basically that a woman who complains about her abortion is because she was weak to begin with. Clearly, some women have prior history of depression, anxiety, substance abuse before they have abortions. Those same women who have abortions, those issues become worse, not better.
Several of the studies have shown there is an increase in suicide or attempted suicide after a pregnancy termination, and it's often on the anniversary of the termination.
Really, the question that's got to be asked is, what's a woman's relative risk of having a mental health problem if she has an unwanted pregnancy and terminates it versus she has an unwanted pregnancy and has that child and raises it, or has that child and gives it up for adoption? I mean, those are really the only options available.
In 2011, I published a meta-analysis in the British Journal of Psychiatry. What was important about this study in the broader scheme of understanding the literature is that comparison group. Women who had an abortion were at a higher risk than women who had unintended pregnancies delivered. Women who had the abortion were over 50% more likely to have negative outcomes. And if we look at the absolute numbers, approximately 20% of women who have an abortion will experience a significant, prolonged, adverse psychological reaction. That's information women need to get.
So even if there's disagreement over the severity of problems, from slight feelings of regret to suicide ideation, if the medical establishment would recognize that even some women are shown to have a negative psychological reaction, then they would be required to treat this like any other medical procedure by providing proper information and support.
I think women who come for an abortion should have some kind of counseling, speaking to somebody who really helps them to clarify in their own mind, is this something you've thought about? All these questions could, in many cases, elicit an answer from somebody who might burst into tears and saying, I don't know if I'm sure. Give support to that woman. Instead of her going through this alone, she's a likely candidate for depression later on.
If women come into an abortion clinic and they say, I don't think I'm going to cope well, I think that I'm going to do horribly, those women, I think, do need to be counseled both prior to the abortion, and they need to have access to counseling subsequently.
Unfortunately, all the women's movement has to offer women who have had an abortion is, this is liberating for you. This gives you sexual freedom, gives you, a choice that will allow you to continue your life. And if you have problems afterwards, there's something wrong with you. It couldn't be the abortion, and sorry, we don't have anything to help you.
Why would a woman, even if she has feelings, she was not going to discuss them, she may not even want to recognize that she has feelings, because if there's no place to process them or talk about them or have them validated, they're just going to be pushed down so that her experience is, I don't have a problem with this.
In contrast, when we lost our son, we were offered counseling, free of charge, for as long as we needed, and for any member of our family, including grandparents. We were encouraged by friends and family to talk about him, not keep him a secret. He was acknowledged, given a name, given a proper goodbye. These were important steps in being able to integrate him and that experience into our lives.
What about people who just kind of go reckless afterwards?
I don't know a lot about that.
Yeah.
I know that sometimes when people have a hard time processing things,
yeah,
it always comes out in other ways.
Right.
Like the human body sort of has to figure out a way to balance itself. And if there's hurting that's unaddressed, then I think that can manifest in behavioral ways. Now we're kind of getting beyond what I usually tell folks.
But when I begin to share for the class, it's like vomiting almost. It's like you get sick, you push it down, and then all of a sudden it all comes out. And I know this is kind of a weird way to think about it, but when you throw up, you feel better after you throw up. Well, for me, it was like getting rid of all of that and letting it out for the first time. And all of this weight just came off of my shoulders, and I could start to begin to feel the freedom. And one of the most amazing things is to see, after I share a story and I walk away from the microphone, to have someone come up and just, I've done what you've done, and you just give them a hug and you hold them, and it's the first step for them.
I was that woman, and you were on the other side. There was no words spoken, just pain, and that hug changed my life. And that is our hope, moving forward. It's nothing but love. There's no judgment. Yes. Nothing but love. We just want That hug.
What women need is sensitive counseling. I think they need to be able to share their experiences publicly with families, friends.
For those who are surrounding women who've had abortions, we need to eliminate any judgmental tone in our discussion of the abortion issue.
A woman facing an abortion already has a lot to consider. But if she has the right to choose, then she also has the right to judgment-free counseling with accurate, unbiased information that could affect her physical and psychological well-being. And information that's tailored to her, especially given that her age, week of pregnancy, and number of abortions are all shown to have a direct effect on all these risk factors. So who is responsible for giving this critical information to women prior to an abortion? Health organizations, researchers, government, and media all have a role to play. But the legal responsibility comes down to the doctors.
If you were undergoing the procedure, would you want to know? I will want to know.
Une information avant, je pense pas que ce soit vraiment un problème parce que de toute façon, quand on a recours à un avortement, c'est parce qu'on veut pas de l'enfant. Donc les conséquences, même si on les connaît avant, on veut quand même se débarrasser de l'enfant. Donc quelles que soient les conséquences, on va dire non, je m'en fiche, je le fais.
Would you want to know about that risk factor?
Yeah, for sure, definitely. Because that will probably change my mind.
Joseph Stanton is a Pennsylvania lawyer whose client sued their abortion doctor and included allegations that they failed to disclose information about how abortion or childbirth would affect their breast cancer risk.
The law of informed consent is this. When a patient is contemplating a surgical procedure, the patient needs to sit down with the doctor who's going to perform the procedure. And the doctor should discuss the procedure in detail with the patient. They need to know the pros, the cons, the risk, the benefits. All of this must be discussed at a time where the patient has time to be informed and to contemplate and then to consent if that is what the patient would like to do. And the discovery that we obtained in that case, the doctor never even spoke to the patient prior to the procedure.
In every other medical procedure, the doctor takes some responsibility for making sure that the benefits are going to outweigh the risks. Because we need to make the doctors finally again liable to actually be doctors. Without that, what basically you have is it's exactly analogous to a woman walking into a doctor's office saying, I have a lump in my breast, I need a mastectomy. And he says, jump up on the table, we'll take it right off. We don't call that medicine. We call that malpractice.
Can you tell us about women's right to know laws?
Women's right to know laws are a very overt attempt to dissuade or discourage women from exercising their right to have an abortion. The whole notion is false, the notion that we doctors are not doing a good job of counseling women about abortion. We are very good at it. We've been doing it some 50 million times in the United States over the last 4 decades.
Frank Court Jr. is a retired member of the Texas House of Representatives who brought forward the Women's Right to Know Act, which mandates pre-abortion counseling on the health risks of abortion and childbirth, including a possible association between abortion and breast cancer.
In the state of Texas in 2003, before this measure passed, every medical procedure that is regulated by the state, and that's pretty much all of them, there's a requirement to tell a patient about the health risks. But there was only one medical procedure that did not have any requirement, and that was an abortion.
Alan Parker is president of the Justice Foundation, an organization that represents clients free of charge, including women who were permanently injured through abortions.
One of the most common arguments for abortion is it should be between a woman and her doctor, not the government. But all of the women that we talk to, and most of the abortion facilities in America will tell you, the woman never sees the doctor until he's performing the abortion. She goes in, she signs some forms, and there's no doctor-patient relationship. Many of the women don't even know the names of the doctors that they're seeing. I think that's the heart of the right to know law. The state is trying to force the abortionist to give the woman truthful information that the abortionists don't want them to know because it would hurt sales. They have a financial interest in seeing that the woman chooses abortion. Their whole profit motive is based on getting a lot of people in a single day and doing a lot of abortions. In the law, we call that a conflict of interest.
Carol Everett was once the owner of multiple abortion clinics. If she and her doctors could get away with the level of medical misconduct that she admits to, we should be ensuring this is not possible in abortion clinics today.
We did 45 abortions the first month and 545 abortions the last month I was there. And I remember those numbers because not only did the abortionists work on a strike commission, but I worked on a strike commission. So my motivation was to sell 40,000 abortions a year to be a millionaire. We have a telephone script designed to overcome every single objection, for that's what sales is, overcome the objection, and you get the order, in this case, the abortion.
People think no abortion law, they interpret that very narrowly to mean, well, nobody can tell you that you're not allowed to have an abortion after a certain number of weeks and all that. But there's a whole outer circle of process that goes on when you have regulatory laws. For example, if there were an abortion law, you would need to collect data. You would need to know how many women are having them, how young are they, what are the rates, what are the after effects.
And we were maiming one woman a month. When I say maiming, I mean to the point of hysterectomy, colostomy, and one woman bled to death. We never counted hemorrhaging or infections as complications, and we never had a lawsuit. And I think it was because of the built-in cover-up of what happens.
When is legislation needed? It's needed when something is abused. When you have a wholesale abuse of women, let's face it, that's what this comes down to. When you have a wholesale denial of their patients' rights to actually be given enough information so that the consent that they provide is actually informed. When you have their rights being violated wholesale, that's when you need legislation.
The intent was never to stop abortion. The intent was to empower women. And I think when you have somebody that's a Republican, a conservative, a white male talking about empowering women, it's just hard to believe. But I have 2 daughters. I have 3 sisters, 3 sister-in-laws, a wife, a mother-in-law. I have a lot of women in my life that I would want to have information if they decide to do that. I may not want them to have that, make that decision, but if they do make that decision, I want them to have that information.
This really has nothing to do with the morality of abortion per se. It's the morality of telling the truth about it.
All you need is to feel sure enough to make the decision for yourself. But if you can't get there, then it's not a good idea, I think.
Okay, I'm gonna go just think about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's a really wise decision.
So here we are now, 4 decades after the legalization of abortion. It's time we stop arguing about abortion as simply a political issue and start talking about the health issues around abortion. Although I still believe in a woman's right to abortion, I don't see abortion as liberating as I once assumed it was, at least not for the women who've experienced adverse physical and psychological effects. It's true, the long-term health risks associated with abortion are generally promoted by those who want abortion gone, but this does not make the information untrue. Those who completely deny any long-term risks have artfully shut down the conversation because they fear if they concede the procedure has adverse effects, abortion will be banned. Meanwhile, nonpartisan researchers run for cover from crossfire. But women facing an unplanned pregnancy deserve health information that is not clouded by religion, fear, or politics. We modern women have some unfinished business. We need to band together as women once more, ask difficult questions, and demand truthful information that is critical to our health. And we must address our dwindling numbers and the tragic loss of 160 million missing girls due to sex selection abortions worldwide. If we as women don't show our concern over these issues, then who will? Will we care for each other? Will we care for ourselves? Will we not at least apply the precautionary principle for our health's sake? I certainly will.
I hope you guys found that very enjoyable. I realize that it is a kind of heavy topic, so if not enjoyable, at least educational. I have watched the documentary multiple times and I learned something new each time. So if I can ask you, Drew, what was the most surprising thing you learned through your work on Hush?
Wow, I think that the surprising thing to me was the very beginning before I even started on it, where I really just went to the Lord with prayer and said, what is it that you want to do? And really, as a writer and producer and director, I thought, oh, well, I'm gonna do this. And so I'll do the thing that you want to do, God. And he gave me a picture of what he wanted to do. And he gave me a picture of a woman sitting on his lap. And he said, and it was on Jesus' lap, and she was pregnant. And he turned to her and said, sweetie, before we made this one, and he pointed at her tummy, said, we made you, and I love you. And I want to come in the spirit of who I am, which is love and truth. And I thought, oh yeah. And he said, and the other thing that he said to me was that, and I thought, oh yeah, that's who you are. And you are both of those things simultaneously. It's exactly your character. And then the other thing that he said to me was, he said, choice is my idea. And I thought, oh yeah, wow. You give us the freedom to choose in our lives. And he says, I put before you life and death, but choose life. And so what he was bringing was this notion of really women's identity as the loved ones who need to know the truth. And the Bible says you'll know the truth and the truth will set you free. And so I just went ahead and I'm like, okay, God, well, I guess I'm going to write and direct this. And he goes, no, not you. And so that was one of the first things that surprised me, because I thought, oh, well, clearly he's, contacted me because he wants me to do this. And he goes, no. And I said, well, then, okay, God, then who? And he said, a woman. So I started to look for a woman. So I thought, oh, this, of course, is going to be a Christian woman, should be a pro-life woman. And I started to look for the women that I knew. And there was a very small number actually in the country that I know of who were very experienced and could handle this level of production in terms of our expectations, production, for the look and caliber of the show. But the ones that I knew were busy. They didn't have any time for the show. And then I thought, okay, well, then I'll start contacting women that I know who were very skillful in Alberta. And so they were like, sorry, pal, this is abortion. I'm not going to die on this hill. And so I was like, okay. And I asked the director of photography if he knew anybody and some other people. And through the director of photography, I met Poonam Gill. And my son and I went to meet with her after I had given her a 21-page outline of the show. And she said, wow, this is amazing. I really want to do this show. And then she said, actually, I think it's important that you know this, that I don't just want to do this show. I feel like I'm meant to do this show. And my son and I looked at each other. We went, oh yeah, she's the one.
So actually, a short anecdote related to that. When I was at the University of Waterloo, my university's pro-life club approached our women's center to see if they would co-host a screening of Hush with us. Now, in theory, they should have been completely on board because this is a documentary that premiered at La Femme International Film Festival. As you mentioned, it has a female pro-choice director. It's about women's health, which should be an area of common ground. But our Women's Center refused, and they said there was misinformation in the documentary. And so I was wondering, how do you respond to hostility like that and just a complete resistance to even exploring what the truth is?
Well, there was a lot of resistance to the film, but honestly, I've experienced far more resistance to the film because people have been, Christian people or pro-life people, have been disappointed that she, in the end, doesn't. Well, I don't want to spoil the film, but in the end, she doesn't become pro-life. And in actual fact, it wasn't about, it's not a political film. It's not a film that goes into, and this is the thing that's amazing about the film. It sets aside every preconceived notion of the battle that goes on every time we mention the word abortion. And it has an entirely different spirit, which is love and truth and life. And that those are the key elements. So in that, women deserve to know. And so Poonam goes after the truth because she's a feminist. And as a woman, then she finds it, and it's vehemently wanting to share that with women because it's what should be done. And honestly, for people in the pro-life movement, it's like, this is the thing that you've been wanting forever, which was to somehow have a word that would go bypass politics that and the preconceived notions about, it's only Christians that are pro-life. It's only and their agenda is the thing that, so we're not going to listen to them because they're Christians. We're not going to listen to them because they're pro-life. And here's a woman who is a mom, who's a woman who is pro-women, and she pours her heart out, and she is upset about this thing. And she's the kind of woman that would charge into any pro-choice context and say, you need to watch this, and get an audience, whether that's with an individual or a group or politicians. And that's what is important, to be able to share and to break through those barriers. And this is the film that can do that. And so honestly, it's kind of like, it's not a film. Pro-life people are already pro-life.
You're right. It is a film for everyone who's considering an abortion, everyone who's post-abortive, women who are considering birth control, considering when to have children, women who, like Kumar Gill, has had a miscarriage later on in pregnancy. So I appreciate your sharing your expertise with us so much, Drew Martin. Thank you very much for your time as well. It is a privilege to have you with us.
Well, bless your hearts, and just bless what you guys do. And I'll be praying for the March for Life and the success of your sharing the film. And thank you so much for doing that.
Thank you.